In the 1920s, growing temperance groups convinced Congress that the U.S. should stop the sale of alcohol, which caused the 18th Amendment. This was a negative turning point in American history because it increased the number of organized crimes, the economy dropped, and showed that you can't run a government on pure morals.
They want your sweet, innocent girls to take to booze so they can be enticed into honky-tonks by slick-haired vultures who prey on the flower of American womanhood. I say alcohol must go.
In the early 1800s, the average American over the age of 15 consumed nearly 7 gallons of pure alcohol a year. During that time, temperance groups made by the American Protestant churches started to protest against the consumption of alcohol because they believed that it was the devil's advocate. They also said that drinking hurt worker productivity, contributed to domestic violence, family disruptions, and was responsible for health problems. In 1820s, the amount of temperance groups started to increase. Most of the groups were made by women. The reason to make them was that they depended on the men to support the family, but the men often drank. The WCTU, which stood for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, arose during this time. The Anti-Saloon League was made in 1893, and their goal was to stop the manufacturing and sale of alcohol. In the 20th century, almost every state had a temperance group. By 1916, about half the states had laws that prohibited alcohol in some way.
Congress ratified the 18th Amendment on January 16, 1919, but it didn't go into effect until January 16, 1920, which made America go dry, and that started the Prohibition. The 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacturing and sale of alcohol. The amendment didn't prohibit the drinking of alcohol, so people bought cases of it when it was still legal and kept it for their own personal use. The Volstead Act was vetoed by President Wilson, but the Senate overrode it, and the act was passed on October 28, 1919, and it was used to enforce the 18th Amendment. The act defined intoxicating liquors as any drink that contained more than 0.5% alcohol, and was also banned the transportation, sale, barter, trade, manufacture, delivery, processing, and possessing alcohol. The only legal way to get alcohol was if it was prescribed by a doctor. This amendment had a lot of mixed reactions. The temperance groups cheered and celebrated this new law, but at the same time, others were completely against it. Although the prohibition was supposed to make the U.S. have good morals, a very dark side began to rise.
At first, the amendment looked like it was actually working. Illegal liquors tended to cost more than the average worker could make. Alcohol consumption decreased by 30%. But then, people began disobeying the law. People known as bootleggers and rum runners started to smuggle alcohol from Canada and areas in the Caribbean. They also made a liquor called moonshine, which is a very powerful alcoholic beverage. By the end of the Prohibition, about 5,000 people died from drinking toxic, home-brewed alcohol. Speakeasies, which were underground clubs, started, and they provided illegal alcohol, music, and entertainment. They were a growing sensation. Often people associated with gangs or organized crimes owned these clubs. Even though police would often raid the clubs, confiscate the alcohol, and arrest the owners of the clubs, they were still very popular because they were so profitable. After the raids, police and other people against alcohol dumped much of the confiscated liquor down the sewers and in the streets. But not all police were like that. Some actually helped the smuggling by escorting the liquor trucks, and they helped watch the bays. They warned the speakeasies of upcoming raids, and in return they got money and alcohol. People who broke the Prohibition law would get fined or sentenced to a few years in jail.
One of the greatest known gangsters during this era was Al Capone. He gave Chicago a bad reputation of being a lawless city. In the 6th grade, Capone quit school and joined a gang in Brooklyn, New York. The leader was Johnny Torrio. In 1920, Capone accepted Torrio's invitation and joined him in Chicago. He became the lieutenant of the Colosimo mob. By 1925, he became the boss of the mob.
The most notorious killing, ordered by Al Capone, happened on February 14, 1929. It's known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and the main reason to this massacre was to kill George Morin, who was a leader of a rival gang. It took place at a garage on 2122nd North Clark Street, where 7 of Morin's men were waiting for a shipment of liquor. 2 of Capone's men disguised themselves as police officers and entered the garage. Morin's men thought it was a police raid, and they lowered their weapons. and placed their hands against the wall. Then, Capone's men pulled out their machine guns and fired at the men. All 7 of them died, but none of them were George Morin. Capone was sentenced to jail on 17th of October 1931.
Elliot Ness was appointed agent of Prohibition in August 1926 by the Treasury Department. He formed a small group called the Untouchables. They worked to destroy Capone's illegal activity. The Untouchables went through blackmail, bribery, and murder, causing them to not be able to trust some of their own men. One of the big people they tried to take down was Al Capone. The Untouchables enforced Prohibition laws and tax laws on Capone and his crew. The Untouchables became legendary for being fearless.
The decisive vote of the 36th state against Prohibition is happy news for the grain raisers of the United States and for many others throughout the land. With an eye on December 5th, work is being rushed in distilleries and bottling works. Thousands are being called back to work in plants of allied industries. At least 500,000 new jobs are predicted as the result of repeal. From keg and barrel factories, perhaps the most closely allied line, immediate benefits from repeal extend into almost every line of business and commerce. However, everyone's not waiting until December 15th. The lid is off in many places, with the downfall of Prohibition being celebrated in real old-time hilarity. Yes, and by the renewal of old acquaintances. Hotels and nightclubs report a real pre-war spirit among those revelers. Boy! Uh-oh! There'll be no more scenes such as this. Barrel after barrel of prize whiskeys destroyed by government agents. It's going to be a cold winter for the barrel busters.
Later this year, on October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed, causing the Great Depression. Word about repealing the 18th Amendment started to be talked about more often. They said that alcohol could actually help the economy because it would make new jobs and they could tax the liquor. At this time, President Hoover was against repealing the amendment. He called the prohibition the noble experiment. Franklin D. Roosevelt beat President Hoover in the 1932 election. He was a supporter of repealing the amendment. He said that the prohibition took money away from the country and gave it to unsavory characters such as gangsters. On December 5th, Congress passed the 21st Amendment. This repealed both the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. Right away, this helped the economy. It made hundreds of thousands new jobs, and the majority of citizens became happy.